Uh, right, well, good morning and welcome to the first in our Move to Portugal virtual roadshow webinar series. Today we aim to explain what's required to move to Portugal in terms of visas, applying for residence, as well as explain some of the other bureaucracy involved when you move to Portugal. We'll also go over the main practicalities that you need to deal with, including accessing healthcare, opening a bank account, voting, getting connected to the internet. I'm Nigel, I run an expat network, and I've lived as an expat around the world, and I moved to Spain 2.5 years ago. So before we start, well, first of all, I'd like to introduce Luis da Silva from our Senior Living. Our property finders and provide a range of relocation support services, including assisting people to obtain their visa and working their way through bureaucracy. Before we start, just to note, say we're here to answer your questions. Please use the button on the screen to submit any questions you have, and we'll answer any that we can during the session, and any that are not answers, we'll answer by email after the webinar. So, perhaps having forgotten to close the door to my meeting room, perhaps I could ask you just to explain who you are, Lewis, and tell a bit about yourself.
No, absolutely. Thanks very much for the invitation, Nigel, and welcome to everyone to this webinar. I think later on maybe there'll be an opportunity for me to show a slide or something around the areas of our business, but I think for now let's get to answering questions. Just a bit about us. Our business was set up around 9 years ago. We work with a range of nationalities, around 30 or so at last count, of people who are looking to migrate permanently or semi-permanently, in this case, to Portugal. We cover the entire country, and we have different business units covering the popular things such as our discovery tours. We have relocation services. We have property finding services, whether it be rentals or purchase. And typically the demographic of our client tends to be a pre-retiree or retiree, although generally we have seen an increase in families, typically those attending international schools, and also a rise in digital nomads from really all over the world, Eastern Europe actually as well, looking to move to Portugal. So that's a little bit about us. We can certainly describe that in more detail further on or later on in the presentation if it's needed.
Okay, thank you, Les. Let's start off with the immigration visa requirements. And the first thing to say is that for short stays, all non-EU citizens, which now obviously includes Brits, are subject to the requirements of the Schengen visa. British people do not need to actually apply for the visa. They are subject to the 90 and 180-day rule. And that basically means you can only spend 90 in every 180 days in the Schengen area, which is most of the EU plus, or the EU plus a few other countries like Switzerland who are established. The basic way to look at it is to look back 180 days, and if in that previous 180 days you spent more than 90 days, then you're outside the rules. Each day goes forward, then the one at the back of the 180 days drops off, so it's a sort of rolling 180 days. People often get confused by it, but if you think of it in that way, look back 180 days, and if you've not been there for more than 90 days, in that 180 days, you're okay. Now you can go multiple stays, you don't have to do all the 90 days in one go, you can come on separate visits, they just mustn't accumulate to over 90 days. So Lewis, how are the authorities monitoring that, and are they enforcing it?
Yes, so the way that they monitor this is really at the entrance and exit points, such as airports and ports. And if this is particular relevance, of course, to British people, you often get people on social media discussing, oh, can I drive over the border to another country? Well, of course, there are very few checks going on between Spain and Portugal, for example, or Spain and France, but you've got to get physically to continental Europe. So I think, especially for British people, they are monitored at entrance and exit points. Often, if you're not resident, the passport will be stamped, and therefore there will be a physical record as well as a system record of the dates in which you're entering and exiting. And so it is important for people to be careful not to overstay they're welcome. And the point that I would make here is you've got to be careful about transit days, because often people think, oh, I'm going to Portugal, for example, and I've counted my days. I've only spent 90 days, but then they're driving there and they forget to count the 2 or 3 days that they're driving through Spain and France, for example. And of course, those also count. So you've got to, as you said, Nigel, got to take into account the entire package deal, as it were, of being in the area. So there is control. I don't know in detail exactly the sort of repercussions, but I do know people who've been given warnings, typically, if they overstay by a couple of days, where the borders agency of the country in which they're exiting figure out that they've actually been in the EU for longer. So they've been given a warning. I don't know anyone who's been banned yet, but that's, I think, because they've sort of seen that people have been, it's just been a mistake in counting, really, more than anything else. I think overstaying beyond there could be a sanction.
Yes, I think that certainly within Spain we have heard of people who have been sanctioned, and standing is within the Schengen rules that you can be fined, but you can also be sort of banned from entry for a period.
Correct.
As with many of these things, it may well depend upon the official that you happen to deal with at the
time,
and that sort of thing. But the other thing is, as you say, it's basically the wet stamp in your passport that they're using. But next year, I understand there's some new arrangements coming in where they'll be looking at the electronics within your passport, basically. And so they'll be much better able to monitor people. So even if your passport hasn't been stamped, they'll still know that you've come within an hour.
That's correct. I mean, I think that the stamp really is for you to then evidence to other authorities, because whenever you're going into the system, there is always an electronic register. There is, of course, from next year, the European Area Travel Information System, the ETIAS system, which will come in, and that is a bit like we're accustomed to filling in for the US. So if you're traveling to the US, then you have to fill in, and it's something that's valid for 3 years. You have to fill in a whole set of information regarding who you are, where you are, sort of background and so on. And a similar electronic system will now start to be implemented in Europe with a validity period, has a low cost. I can't remember exactly how much it is, but yes, you're right. That will come in from next year. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So then looking at longer stays, what are people's options if they want to stay longer than 90 days?
Yeah, so really, if we're talking clearly, the audience of this call is primarily non-EU citizens, and in order to be able to move to Portugal, stay for longer, you need a visa of sorts. I don't think we're going to go through all the visas. In Portugal specifically, there are a whole range of visas known as, typically designated with a D. So D1 for work, D7 for retirement, D3 for technology, whatever. I even get confused with them, but a D visa. So you will basically, short answer is, you'll need a visa if you want to remain for longer than 90 in every 180 days. Need a visa of sorts.
Yeah, okay. So just quickly on the sort of work visa, I know in Spain you can't apply for a visa and then apply for a job. You have to, the employer applies to it. Is it the employer or the individual that applies for the work visa?
So the individual actually applies, but the principle of the support in support of that visa is the same. You have to have in this case it's a D1 visa, which I would add, Nigel, is a low probability, because not many people are coming to Portugal to work. To be fair, it's not a country known to have a hugely dynamic work market. The exception to that is probably the tech sector, where there's been a whole range. I don't know how many people know about the Web Summit. It's the world's largest sort of meeting place of technology opportunities and investors and so on. So with the exception of tech, maybe a little bit in healthcare, tourism, but that's seasonal. Pretty much everything else, Portugal is not really the shining beacon in terms of attracting talent, because salaries are low and so on. So you need to have someone actually make you a work offer, okay? And the employers must meet the conditions of employing a foreign person, okay? So they, as an employer, need to get their ducks in a row to make sure they can employ you. So there are Portuguese and EU legislation that they need to meet, and then they must present you with that job offer, which you will incorporate into your D1 application, together with things such as proof that you have no criminal record, you must have health insurance, and a number of other things. I often say to people, imagine the UK in reverse. It's the same sort of thing. You know, you need to prove that you have the ability to then sustain yourself via work when you arrive in the country. It's the same process. Again, I reinforce, I would find it highly unusual that anyone on this call, or very few people on this call, are in that category, because the exception to the rule to sort of a D1 working visa are probably people, highly qualified people, such as a foreign company that's setting up a subsidiary in Portugal, and therefore is bringing a senior executive to Portugal as a way of establishing that company in the country and sort of replicating the company culture to make sure that there's alignment and so on. Other than that, really, it's not a popular route.
Okay, so as you said, the majority of people have registered on this have indicated that they're coming here to Spain, or planning to move to Spain to retire. So let's look at the two sort of main visas options there, which are the D7, as you say, or otherwise the passive income visa, and the golden visa, where we've obviously property investment. So first of all, the D7. The first thing to say is you have to demonstrate that you have sufficient financial funds to support yourself, and you basically have to have private healthcare initially to go. The minimum income requirement is 100% of the minimum wage, so that's 8,460 in 2022, and that is substantially lower than Spain, where the requirement is basically 27,000.
Correct.
Thereabouts. So you can include dependents within that visa, and you have to then have an additional 4,230 for each dependent.
Yeah, half the main applicants' value. Yeah.
So, and unlike the Spanish one, I understand you can work in Portugal under this visa. So, perhaps you could outline the process requirements for obtaining the visa.
Sure. No, indeed I can. What I was going to do at this stage here, and I'll just perhaps share my screen. I've got a little slide on where am I? On the D7. So I'm just going to share that quickly. That was just a cover slide. Forgive me, I'm just going to page down here if I can get this thing to page down. There we go. So just briefly to recap what you've said. So the D7 as a residency solution, it's exactly what you said, an income-based visa. And it can be obtained either, because a key component, which you didn't mention, but is of course essential, is that you must prove you have somewhere to stay. So you can obtain this visa either by proving that you've purchased a property and there's no minimum value, unlike the golden visa, which we'll come to in a second, or via long-term residential rental contract. And I should point out there, depending on where you are as an applicant, the Portuguese consulates in different countries are applying different rules, although there's a tendency to gradually all gravitate towards the same rule, which is the 12-month residential contract. But there are still certain contracts, for example, in the Far East, certain Indian contracts in South Africa, for example, and there was even at one stage one of the US consulates that remained and continued to accept, the Canadian consulates every once in a while, Scotland in the UK, that are accepting 6 months contracts or rental contracts. So what we always say about that particular point in accommodation is we no longer even give a prognosis, because this thing changes all the time, and that is people need to check with their local consulate before they start what their particular local consulate is accepting in terms of the residential rental contract, and that can be checked directly with the consulate or with VFS, which is visa amalgamation service, a big global player.
So that presumably for people who are sort of planning to come over to rent and then buy, that can presumably be a bit of an issue, because if you only take 6 months rental with the expectation that you'll then buy, you're going to have to check those regulations.
You are, and actually you've pointed out a very important point. There's actually a conflict here between the law, which perfectly allows for a residential contract of less than 1 year. There's a variation of the law which actually states that if you are looking for a permanent home, for example, you can write that into the contract and justify to the, shall we say, government, why you've got a contract of less than 1 year. So perfectly feasible according to the law, but the consulate will not accept that. So there are some ways in which you you can mitigate this. For example, the law also stipulates that you can give notice after a certain period. Typically, it's around 2/3 of the duration of a contract. But in these scenarios, Nigel, it's all about working out a balanced scenario between the landlord and the tenant. So it's worth going to some detail here too, because I think it's what we call rental etiquette for new residents. So if you are in that category of a rent before buy client, and we have many clients in that category, then declare so upfront. Normally what we would do is we would work with the landlord. They would still issue a full year contract, but they would be expecting you to give notice at some point during that contract. Now you can imagine if that is your intention and intent, then what you need to do also is you need to time the start of your rental contract in such a way that the owner is not going to suffer a financial loss as a result of your early cancellation. And what I mean by that is, don't try to start a rental contract intending to buy, and that rental start date is in sort of just before summer, because if you want to give notice after 7 months, what you're doing is you're getting a cheap summer rental, and the owner will not want that. So it's important, if you are a rent before buy customer or client or applicant, that you try to time your start date, and this applies to Portugal, applies to Spain, after the summer, ideally, okay? Because otherwise the owners would not want to cut short a rental contract, because they'll just be losing good revenue in the summer, which they could have rented out by the week to someone else if you hadn't come along. So yeah, that's an important point. The D7 can be combined with other tax programs. So where you qualify, so the NHR, the non-habitual residency, for example. And importantly, the application must be done from the country of origin, okay? The reason why sometimes people need help with this is realistically because there are several challenges involved here. It implies gathering data. Not all of it is easy to understand. It involves multiple experts, talking to the bank, somebody getting your NIF, which is the equivalent to the NIA in Spain, things like that. Many service providers are local or regional, so you need to navigate your way around all this stuff. And then follow-up in Portugal has been particularly slow. People are very, very busy, but it's also cultural. Sometimes there's a bit of a lack of follow-up and lack of response. And then importantly, seasonality plays a role here in terms which I've partly alluded to. But if you're going to a region like the Silver Coast or the Algarve, you need to be wary of the fact that some of the owners will not be keen to start a rental sort of in the summer, where they could be perhaps getting expensive and better priced summer rentals. So just to come back to your point, Nigel, about what you need. We've actually set up a site called movetoportugal101.com, which actually has a number of little steps which must be completed. So there are 5 really important ones. We call them the big 5. You must get a fiscal number. And these are things you can do at a distance. So none of this is impossible to do from afar with a bit of time. You know, about a month or so would allow you to get the 2 to 3 weeks for the fiscal number, the bank account, and so on. So you need your fiscal number together with fiscal representation, because you will not be resident initially in Portugal, although that's what you're applying for. You need a bank account. And of course, as you've alluded to, you need to fund that, although you mentioned the threshold, but you also need to fund that bank account for the D7. And there are different values that are mentioned, but we often say, depending on the consulate, that will vary. We recommend you funding in the region of 7,000 to 12,000 euros, putting that as a deposit into the account. You then initially you need travel insurance, and this is important to explain. The reason you initially need travel insurance is because the Portuguese government wants to see that you have coverage for any medical condition before you're actually a resident in the country. So when you get your visa and it's successful, you will initially get a visa, which is a temporary visa for 120 days, 4 months, that allows you to have your in-country interview. And during that period, you are only a temporary resident of the country. You're only staying there, entitled to stay for 120 days. So if you have, goodness forbid, a major health problem, you need to have private coverage. And in the extreme, you need to have repatriation cover as well. So you need specific health insurance for that period of time. And after that period of time, you can move to the private health insurance or the state system, which we'll cover later on. So you then need a rental contract or proof of purchase. And then we also recommend that you talk to a Forex provider, because you will be transferring money between typically a non-euro denominated country and the EU, in this case, Portugal. So those are the things that you need to focus on. That's a different slide. So I'll just go away from that. So those are the things that you need, Nigel, to put in place. You need to bring those all together. You then have an application form you need to fill in, a letter of motivation, you need your criminal certificate, and you need to bring all these things together and book an appointment at the closest consulate to you, the consulate that covers your region, as it were.
Okay. And so in terms of that, sort of being able to prove the financial means, what are they, does that vary from consulate to consulate, or is there a very standard sort of requirement?
Yes, yeah, the answer is probably always, I think you'll probably learn in Portugal, the answer is yes, it depends. Of course, there's the law, but you'll see that so many people have their own sort of interpretation of it. You know, we in terms of the financial requirement which you've set out, those are the numbers. But the source of the financial income can sometimes be certain sources can be accepted by certain consulates and certain sources not. So the sources that are always accepted are things such as passive income. So if you are a pensioner and you have your pension, that's considered pretty passive now because you're not working, and that's an easy source. So if you're coming from the US, Social Security, IRA funds, a pension in the UK, for example, a statement from HMRC regarding the pension you're receiving, those sorts of things are easy and always accepted. Investment income is also accepted. Interestingly enough, it's not very useful for things like getting a mortgage, but it is very useful for underpinning your visa application. And interestingly enough, we have heard of several cases, it's not an isolated incident, several cases of people actually submitting work income. So remote workers such as digital nomads who apply for the D7 visa have actually in part or in full been able to also apply with a combination of, let's call it, savings and then their income from remote based activities. So in answer to your question, Nigel, there is an element of interpretation or latitude that the consulates apply And so really it's an individual thing, but passive income, the true passive income is still the best form.
Okay, and how long does it normally take for a decision?
About 60 days.
60 days. And that's reasonably consistent, or
reasonably consistent. We've had some people, you know, doing a lot less. The US is a lot of volume, so we always use the US as reference because we've got people in sort of 17 days and a few people that have taken 3 months, but we would say on average around 60 days, pretty consistent.
And then on renewal, you renew for what period, and is that a straightforward process? Yeah,
so let's go take a step back. So the first process, or the first visa, is a temporary one for 120 days. You then have to go to what we call the borders agency called SAF meeting. We don't know anyone who hasn't been approved for that. Very, very important at that meeting. The biggest, the most important element is the proof of where you're going to stay, a rental contract or the other thing, plus all, you know, your ID and whatever. They will then approve you for 2 years, and then you have a renewal, and that's fairly straightforward at the end of the 2 years. Sorry.
Right. So okay, so let's then move on to the golden visa.
Yeah.
The golden visa is available to people who can invest into Portugal, and gives you, as I would call it, the right but not the obligation to sort of take up residence in Portugal. So the minimum stay period is 7 days, but you can stay for 365 days. But of course, the critical point is whether you go over 183 days and become tax resident in Portugal. If you don't want to become tax resident in Portugal, then you would stay less than 183 days. The issue there is that you know, you would become liable on all of your worldwide income if you do become tax resident in Portugal. There are various options for investing in Portugal under that, investing in businesses and various other things, deposits into banks and so on. But the most common is undoubtedly investment into property. And you can invest in that property, have it in investment income, you know, for investment income by renting it out, or you can buy it to live in. So whatever reason. It doesn't have to be a single property, I gather. You can have multiple properties. And the basic requirement is to invest 500,000, but there are lower amounts if you're in urban regeneration areas, or if you're buying older properties, or indeed if you're buying a combination of both. So there were new rules came in from January this year, and that has restricted the areas. So perhaps, Lewis, if we could pass over to you, and we can go into that in a bit more detail after my fly through overview.
Yes, we can. I'm going to share my slide again. My computer again. Hopefully you can see this now. And there's one particular point that need to clarify, and that's around the 500,000. So I'm just firstly going to talk viewers through the difference between the D7 and the golden visa, and then I'll talk about the golden visas. So the D7. Just a simple table here. You can see this, I take it, Nigel, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, good. So the D7, what I term the investment level does not depend on the region, okay? The golden visa very much does, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. And it also depends, as you've alluded to, as to whether it's a sort of a new build resale property, or is something that requires rehabilitation, okay? Then the rental or purchase element, the D7 allows for either the golden visa is only a purchase, and no debt can be used for the amount of, or the respective amount of the golden visa for which an application is being made. So up to the threshold of the golden visa, no debt. If you buy a more expensive property, you can finance the rest. And we'll talk, I think you wanted to ask me a question about that later on, which I can cover. The minimum levels of investment. So the D7, there is no minimum level of investment. You buy whatever you like. But in the golden visa, there are strict minimum levels depending on, again, where you are buying or not. And here I'd like to talk briefly about the 4 levels, and I'm going to talk in general terms because the next point I'm going to point out what is no longer available. But the original Golden Visa program foresaw 2 types of areas. They foresaw high density and low density areas, and these areas are exactly what the name implies, namely that the high density areas are areas where the population density is higher than the national average. Okay, and in Portugal, because of the way that the population has moved and the popularity of the coastal areas, most of this population concentration, with few exceptions, are along a band of maybe 50 kilometers or so from the coast. Okay, then you have your low density areas, which are everything else, and also the islands of Madeira, the archipelago of Madeira, and the Azores, which at the moment, of course, as you know, is experiencing some earthquake issues on the island of Saint George. But you then have within each of those high density and low density areas the possibility of having regeneration real estate. And what this is it's product or property typically older than 30 years that is within a designated urban regeneration area, which are areas that the government has targeted as wanting to focus or funnel investment into, in order that foreign capital can revitalize and replenish, renovate those areas. And of course, what that's led to is a discount, excuse me, of 20% against the normal level. So if you look at the difference between high density and low density, apologies, is 20%, and then you've got a discounted level on the refurbishment property as well. Now, in terms of the changes to these programs, whereas we don't see any changes in the D7, we have had a major change to the Golden Visa program at the start of this year. Okay, and it means that high density areas no longer qualify for residential property, okay, from the beginning of this year. And I'll cover that in the next slide, but it has a direct impact on this 500,000 and the 350,000 bit, because you can't buy any property to live in, essentially, that is within those high density areas. And you may ask, well, if I can't live in it, what can I do with it? Well, you can rent it out, for example. So you can buy touristic property, or you can buy commercial property in those areas and qualify. And you can still buy residential property in those areas, but you just will not qualify for the Golden Visa. Okay. So as Nigel, as you mentioned, in-country presence, D7, typically 183 days. You've got to prove that you're actually resident in the country, whereas the Golden Visa is on average 1 week, but actually it's a bit different. You get your first visa for 2 years and then you renew it. So in that 2-year period, you need to spend 14 days. You can actually spend the 14 days together in 1 year and you will have got your 7-year average. So you've got to look at the detail of this. You don't have to spend 7 days and 7 days. You can do a 14-day contiguous period within that 2-year period and then repeat it to the next. The NHR status, which is that special tax status, I don't know if we have any questions about that later or not, but anyway, you pretty much would be eligible to qualify for or to apply for the NHR status with a D7, but not with a Golden Visa, because you're not actually spending the time. That's one of the reasons why many people apply for the Golden Visa, is they physically cannot or do not wish to spend the time in Portugal, and they just want the residency. And so if you want to get started on the residency process, for example, with a view to future citizenship, which are 2 distinct things. But if you want to get started, but you're still working, or you can't afford the time to be in country, then you would probably go the Golden Visa route. In terms of multiple properties, again, as you've mentioned, Nigel, you can definitely buy multiple properties using the Golden Visa, but it's not really applicable for the NHR, for the D7, because you're living in a property, so you only need 1, you can't live in 2. And then we always point out to people that they do need to be aware of the fact that some of these programs, and the Golden Visa is one of them, can lead to inflation and overinflation in some cases of property prices. And that's distinctly what happened in Lisbon and Porto, for example, with the Golden Visa. Had a lot of Chinese investors. 6 billion worth of investment has come into Portugal as a result of the Golden Visa program. And some of that has caused an inflationary effect on the property prices. So to talk about the Golden Visa specifically, which is now to clarify your map, and apologies, it's not very clear, but the colors that they've used are difficult to contrast against the background. Now, on the right, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor moving. So this is the official map. All the blue areas are what we term low density areas in Portugal, okay? Continental Portugal. The islands, as I say, Madeira and the Azores, are all low density as well. The red areas are low density areas, parishes in high density municipalities, okay? And the gray area, which is not very visible, but this is the coastline of Portugal. I'm running my cursor down there. This is kind of something like this, okay? Go down.
Lewis, unfortunately, the cursor is not visible.
Oh, right, okay. So there is a grey land mass to the left, to the west of the blue mass, and also, broadly speaking, between those two blue legs at the south, at the bottom, and those are the high density areas. So you'll often see people mention the entire coast of Portugal is high density. That's not strictly correct. There are some low density areas on the coast, and they are effectively concentrated along the Alentejo Peninsula and in the extreme east and west of the Algarve. So there's actually eligible Golden Visa residential property in the Algarve, for example. A lot of people will say there's not, but there is. But most of the coast, it is true to say, in continental Portugal will no longer be eligible for the Golden Visa. And why is this important? This is important because whether or not to go the D7 route or the Golden Visa is a very important choice for you listening to this presentation if this is the route to go in Portugal. And that is because many people want to start with a Golden Visa, but at some point they see themselves moving or spending extended periods of time in Portugal. And we always counsel people to consider very carefully this point, because if where they want to live in Portugal is in an area which is considered not eligible anymore, then it may be worth waiting a couple of years and applying for the D7 rather than wasting money on a Golden Visa product, which is not going to be of great use for you as a resident. So that's a key aspect in terms of the decision-making process. So in terms of routes to residency, the Golden Visa will then allow you all the rights of a resident in Portugal, and you'll have those rights accrued as a result of the Golden Visa acquisition itself. You need to make the investment before you can make the application. I'll start sharing this. So you need to prove that you have the title deeds of the property in your hand, or at least pay the transfer tax. Sometimes that's accepted. And then there's a separate process for registration of the application for the Golden Visa. And even though it takes some time to get it, it's the application date that counts in terms of your eligibility for residence.
Okay, so you talk about not being able to use borrowed funds. Does that include borrowing from an overseas institution rather than a Portuguese institution?
No. I should point out, of course, what Portuguese banks are looking for, what the Portuguese government is looking for, is that you're not using Portuguese sourced funds to purchase what essentially should be foreign funds. So you can go and find a mortgage elsewhere. I would say, just as a comment, that that's highly unlikely. What is more likely is that you release equity, for example, from an overseas property, release those funds, and then transfer the cash and make a cash payment to for the purchase. So anything that is sourced overseas is eligible, but you can't go and apply for a local mortgage, for example.
Right, okay. And in terms of the property, you have to hold on to that throughout the period you hold the visa, is that correct?
Well, you have to hold so you have to hold qualifying property or properties during the entire period in an uninterrupted fashion. So you don't have to hold the same property if you decide afterwards, well, I want to move to another property for whatever. When I say move, I mean move my investment to another property. You can do that, but you must make sure that that property's ownership overlaps with the other one. So it's more likely that you're going to buy the second one and then try to sell the first one. So the answer is you've got to have continuous investment meeting the threshold for the full 5 years.
Okay, and okay, so if once people have the visa, is there a separate residency process, or is that part of the visa process?
No, it's the same thing. So that is the visa is the residency process. There are a few things you may need to do if you're actually going to physically live in country. So here I'm still answering with the golden visa in mind. So you wouldn't, for example, register at the local parish under a golden visa because you're actually not physically remaining in country, but you would register at the local parish if you were getting your residency via the D7, for example. But the visa is the residency. It is the process that gives you the right to live in Portugal.
Okay, we've got a question coming in here. Can you get NIF in person if you're going to Portugal on holiday?
You can indeed, but remember that most of the and it's a fairly simple thing. It costs 10 euros or something like that, so it's really cheap. But you must remember that you normally need to book these days for these kind of appointments still because of COVID. So you may have an inconsistent approach across the different what we call them finanças. So you could try to walk in and get a fiscal number. But remember, you then also need your fiscal representative because you won't be, one assumes, resident in Portugal. Short answer is yes, but and it's quite quick, or can be quite quick, but you need to make sure you have all the eligibility criteria, such as your proof of your home address, your fiscal representative, and so on, in order to get it.
Okay, and what about permanent residents? Having got these visas, either a D7 or golden visa, how do people qualify for permanent residence, and what are the benefits of that?
Right. So one of the firstly, you qualify for permanent residence after a continuous period of residence in Portugal under what we term the temporary residence, which would be the 5 years of the golden visa, the 5 years of the D7, and so on. The minute those 5 years are up and you've proved that you've been in the country, you are eligible for permanent residence. You will then get a permanent residence stamp in your passport. You don't have to apply for citizenship. Okay. This is not a requirement. You may, and most people often do, because if they've lived in the country, there's the benefit of getting the Portuguese passport, which is a powerful passport globally, relative to many others, because it's one of the EU passports. So the benefits of permanent residence are that you don't need to renew your residence all the time. As long as you keep meeting the criteria of residence, you don't have to go in and do another appointment, get another stamp, and so on. You're in. It's over. You don't need to be sort of jumping through hurdles. You also get eligibility and this applies to temporary and permanent residence. So residence gives you rights to things such as voting, access to healthcare, any age-related discounts, vaccination program access, and stuff like that. So residence, whether it be temporary or permanent, gives you access to all those benefits together with any other thing. I don't know if you wanted me to sort of also cover off citizenship here or not.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So citizenship is different. That's just where you apply to become a citizen of the country, and you ask for it, or you apply for its passport. And in this case, Portugal's passport is, I believe, the 6th most powerful in the world. And when they say powerful, there is a ranking that is done globally. And typically one of the big factors that influences this ranking is the number of bilateral agreements that the country has with other countries in terms of allowing visa-free travel, for example. You also will get protection from the consulate if you're traveling somewhere and, for example, war breaks out, and if there's consular representation, or there is, consular representation in an associate consulate and so on. So all the protections you would get of a government protecting you, you will get from the Portuguese government, in addition, in most instances, to the country of which you are originally a citizen. And I say this because Portugal is very liberal in allowing multiple citizenships. It's one of the countries in the world that I'm aware of that allows literally, I don't want to say unlimited because I don't know if that's the case, but multiple citizenships. Where, for example, in Spain, that's not the case. There must be, the country of which your other citizenship is must also allow multiple citizenships. Otherwise, if there isn't reciprocity, there is that limitation. So the rules in Portugal are a lot more free and liberal than, for example, the corresponding rule in Spain generally. Okay, and I think the other important thing that applies to citizenship is it cements your right in law. Okay, and I think for any of you listening from the UK, you all know how we lived through the period, the dreaded B word, for so many years. And if you look at the 3 or 4 million, however many EU citizens in the UK, effectively, the rights that they believed were ensconced in law changed after the referendum. And they changed because they were on a residency, if you will, and not on a citizenship. So the only way to lock those in would now, for example, be to apply for British citizenship as long as you have settled status. It's exactly, if you look at that in reverse, it's exactly the same thing. If in 20 years, the EU decides that residency isn't enough to guarantee your rights, which I don't think would happen, but one never knows, then the only way to lock those rights in law is by becoming a citizen. So if you are at all worried that future political change, decision-making, or whatever it may be, may change your rights, citizenship is the way to lock them in.
Right, okay. So what are the sort of bureaucracy that people have to deal with if they move to Portugal beyond the visa and residence?
How many hours have we got here, Nigel?
That's an overview.
An overview, yeah. So I always say to people, suggestion, and this is, it's not just a Portuguese quirk. It really applies to a lot of Southern European countries, but I always say to people, don't move to Portugal if you're not prepared to accept some element of delays, inconsistent answers from professionals. I always have a point about sort of accountants or tax advice. Ask for accountants or lawyers and you will get 5 answers, and you basically need to go through and ask different people and then form an opinion based on the sort of majority view. And this is not necessarily a criticism of the many good professionals that exist, but often the interpretation of the law leads to some of this confusion. So don't move if you're not prepared for some government bureaucracy. So be prepared to insulate yourself from this by working with some professionals. There are the equivalent in Spain would be, for example, a gestor, but in Portugal we don't have that figure type. It's a different concept, but we have several people, companies, or whatever that will help you to reduce the impact and the contact that you have with the state in terms of the bureaucracy, and that's money well worth spent to save yourself the wear and tear that you will feel. So that's the biggest That's the biggest general point I would make is that. A couple of specific points. So importing a vehicle, hugely bureaucratic, hugely complex, and potentially expensive exercise. There are rules that need to be followed in regards to the prior ownership of a vehicle. It must be in your name during a minimum period, which is 6 months, registered in your name before you import it. You must add it to your personal effects, but you must find somebody that also does all the customs declarations and so on to make sure that you can avoid the customs duties. You will need to get things such as the certificate of conformity, which is a formal document from the original manufacturer to make sure that that car conforms to EU standards, and that in itself is a bureaucratic, or can be a bureaucratic process with your original your OEM in your country of origin. So as you can gather, importing a car is one of those that should be avoided. I mean, from the UK, it's an easy thing because you're driving on the wrong side of the road anyway, and therefore it makes no sense to bring in a car with a steering wheel on the right hand side. It'll make overtaking more difficult and dangerous, you know, and driving in roundabouts and things more dangerous. So you should probably not do it anyway. But if you are coming from a country like the US, or wherever, Canada, that is driving on the same side of the road as in Portugal, then you will need to consider these other things. But definitely, when you mention bureaucracy, importing a car is one of those. And the other thing that you should be getting ready for is with telecoms suppliers. So Portugal is quite a well-wired country, if I can use that term. So coverage, internet and so on is very good, but often there isn't a choice of suppliers in certain areas. And so you're left with the big supplier, you know, Mao is the name that often comes to mind, and they are really not, they don't have great customer service is all I would say. And so you know, what you will find is you will need a certain resilience to be able to deal with utility suppliers and telecoms companies because their customer service is not great, and you may have an issue and it will take a long time to resolve. So those sort of issues are the most bureaucratic ones.
Okay, and going back to cars perhaps, can you drive in Portugal on your UK license, or do you have to get a Portuguese license, or can you drive on other EU passport driving license? Yeah, so simple answer to the question: yes, you can drive. You can actually, strangely enough, if you're a non-resident, you can drive up to 185 days on a foreign license as a non-resident. I haven't quite figured out then how you'll do the 185 days because you're actually tipping over into the residence things, but the law actually allows you to drive basically for a half a year. But if you are if you become a resident, then sorry, and I should state that you can drive up to 185 days if your country signed up to the I think it's the 1949 or the 1968, or either of the conventions. There are some global or European road conventions. If your country in which you've got your license issued is signed up to that convention, so I know the UK signed up to the 68 convention, I think in 1971 or something. So you can drive for pretty much half a year as a kind of touring around person. But of course, you can't do 185 days because you've got the 180-day rule. But if you are a resident, you've only got 90 days in which to, after getting residence, to actually exchange your license. And you need to have your, I don't know the full list, but you need your original license, you need the proof of your residence. And also important in Portugal, depending on your age, you will need an eye test, and you will need the doctor to then load up that eye test results and an okay kind of tick thing onto the system of the IMT, which the IMT is the kind of the equivalent of the DVLA in Portugal. So they'd have to load up that result as part of your application to exchange your license. And you don't have to take a test, or? No, you don't have to take a test if you don't let your license expire. So do not, under any circumstances, do not
try to, think you're going to take longer than 90 days or do whatever, get a firm to do this, whatever, because if once that's expired and you're no longer eligible to drive, you will have an issue. You'll have to take a test, and you'll have to take it in Portuguese, as far as I'm aware. You can't do English language driving tests and so on and so forth. And again, I think slightly different in Spain, if I'm not mistaken, because you do have to take a test, right?
Well, at the moment, it depends. There is if you were here before 31st December 2020, then you're okay until the end of June currently, and there's negotiations going on. And ultimately, it's expected that you will not have to take a test, but basically you do. If you arrived after the end of Brexit, then you would, after 6 months, have to take a test. Yes, so that's the current position, but expected to change. And if one of the things in Spain, I know that is different about car insurance from the UK, is that it's the car rather than the person that is insured, which is extremely useful when people come to visit, because they can use the car without having to go through any extra cover or anything. Is that the same principle in Portugal?
Yes. So it's a combination almost, but you take out your insurance and it's linked to the person and the car. So you get a kind of a discount if you've got a no claims bonus or whatever you're doing. But then you have to take out insurance which is car specific as well. So you've got to the insurance applies to the car, and you have to validate, and you've got to carry that. There's like a little square form. One is the MOT, the equivalent of the MOT or the roadworthiness of the car, and the other is the insurance relating to the car, which you have to carry around and you have to show in a visible location. What I was going to point out here, though, Nigel, is the following. Because often people, car insurance in Portugal is an absolutely essential thing, because it is one of the source of more fines than anything. If you're coming from the UK, just pitching this to the UK audience at the moment, if you're coming from the UK, in the UK, no one's checking anything. No one's checking whether you've got valid insurance. No one's checking whether you've got liability insurance. No one's checking whether your car is roadworthy, unless there's an accident or there's a reason to check. There's no preemptive checks of anything. In Portugal, it's quite the contrary. There are always stops. The police are always out checking for documentation and doing arbitrary stops and checking your documentation. So, you can't be forgetful. I'm not implying that people are wanting to not have the insurance, but you can't be forgetful about these sorts of things. So when addressing this to residents, okay, it's very easy. You've got to get insurance, and you've got to make sure that it's up to date and visible, because if you update it but don't put it on there, they'll fine you anyway.
Right. Okay. Let me just sort of go back to a question we had. Apologies, this is
it's okay.
About residents, but so we are retired UK nationals living in France. We both have our NIF numbers, but we do not have carte de séjour, and that's the French position, I think. Is this a problem? I think they are planning to move to Portugal. I presume they have to effectively apply from the start, do they?
Yeah, so I'm making a couple of assumptions here. So did you say they were UK citizens, were they?
They're retired UK nationals living in France.
Okay, so I am assuming that France is their current country of residence.
Yeah.
Okay, and if that is the case and that assumption is correct, then what they need to do, again, making the assumption they haven't also taken up French citizenship, but otherwise they wouldn't be asked the question, but they would need to apply from the country in which they are currently resident, which is France, okay? So they need to go to the Portuguese consulate in France. They would then need to get, so the application would need to be done from France, and they would need to get the criminal clearance certificate from France and they may need it as well from the UK, depending on how long they've been living in France. So that's the tricky bit. Everything else is the same as if they were applying from the UK. Okay, so on the assumption that they have changed their residence to France and they can demonstrate they are a resident in France, the two areas I can immediately think of are A, they must apply from the French consulate, and they will need a criminal certificate for the last 12 months at least there, and maybe the UK. And if they are thinking importing a vehicle, there will have to be an importation from France, where they will have to have registered that vehicle in their name in France, where they're a resident.
Okay, thanks. Right.
Yeah.
So first we could just cover off healthcare.
Yeah.
Can people moving to Portugal access the healthcare system? And does that vary according to which sort of visa they have?
No, first answer is yes, and second answer is, as long as it's a residency visa, there's no difference. There's also no difference on where you go in Portugal. It's the same anywhere in Portugal in terms of the access rules. So the procedure or the process to register for the local healthcare system, which again for UK people or nationals is very similar to the NHS. In the UK, the SNS, the Sistema Nacional de Saúde, is very similar to the National Health System in the UK in terms of rules, the way it operates, with the exception that there is a copay typically for most people, although there are a whole range of exceptions for older people, people with serious illnesses, people with incomes below a certain threshold, and so on. So lots of exemptions. But you basically can get into the system from the time that you are resident, and you do that by having registered at your local parish and taking that proof of residency in your local parish to your local health center. And then you will, for the first time you do that, you will get a national health number, Cartão do Utente de Saúde, and then you're in the system, and then you can use the national health system. A lot of people, when I say people, I mean a lot of expats moving or foreign people moving to Portugal, for example, for retirement, will also carry private insurance, but it's not compulsory. Whether it's needed or not depends on your circumstances, but you will have access to the national health system from that period of time. The copay, by the way, is typically on three things where you'll notice it. There's a copay on consultations, which if you don't have an exemption is around €5. There's a copay on hospital appointments, which is around €15, excluding any diagnostics, which like x-rays and whatever, which you may have done, but really, really inexpensive. So nothing to worry about if you're faced with an emergency and having to go to a hospital, and then you pay a copay on the medication at pharmacies. The whole pharmacy sector went through a huge revolution, maybe around, I don't know, maybe a decade or so ago, with the introduction of generics, and the government actually controls there's a price list where the pharmacy has to show, I believe it's the 3 cheapest or the 5 cheapest generics, and give you the choice to choose from those. So that was a huge change in the sector, which drove down the costs of prescription medicine, but there is a copay in regards to that, which is different, again, using the UK as an example. I know the audience is primarily UK. The copay in the UK is kind of a fixed amount. In Portugal, it's an amount per item, if you will. So you pay a little. So if you've got a very cheap item, you'll only pay a few cents. Whereas, for example, in the UK, you'd pay your standard £5 or whatever it is, a minimum per prescription. So cheap items become very expensive in Portugal. Expensive items become very cheap in the UK. Right.
Okay. So now, what about banking? How easy is it to open a bank account in Portugal? And can you do that before you become resident? And is there any benefit in doing so?
Yeah, so banking's reasonably easy. I think today you don't see the difference that you saw a few years ago, Nigel, but the Portuguese banking system, I remember when I lived in South Africa many years ago, I was fascinated by how advanced the Portuguese banking system was, and that was maybe 30 years ago, whatever it was. Banking system in Portugal is quite evolved, a lot of online banking, a lot of the banks have multilingual stuff. If you become resident in Portugal, you should have a bank account. There's no one who I know lives in Portugal without a bank account. You'll need this for direct debits, for payments, your local cards, managing currency. So it's not practical to live in Portugal without a bank account. In answer to your question, you can set this up in advance. If you're thinking of moving to Portugal, and applying through one of the visas, you should set this up. It's a compulsory requirement to have a bank account. So you should set this up in advance, and it's perfectly feasible to do so. So we work with several banks, depending on where you are as an applicant for residency visa. So we will recommend different or introduce you to different banks, because there are some banks that work better with US applicants and others that work better with British applicants and others that cater, for example, for Asia a little bit better, and so on. So in principle, the short answer is you can open a bank account remotely, although it's a little bit easier probably to do in person. Right. And you need to also look at things such as fees and the like, because there is some difference between bank fees, and there are some banks these days that actually have a fee-less system, so no fee system, no cost. And of course, those banks are more interesting because there's no need for complex banking requirements for most people.
Okay, and we'll be covering off mortgages in the property session we have going out tomorrow. So we'll leave that for tomorrow.
Yeah. So sorry, Nigel. What I can say again, I come back to that point. That simple website we created specifically for this. If people go to the movetoportugal101.com site, on that site, they will see described in more detail what can be done at a distance and not. But banking is definitely one of those things. And we encourage people to get their fiscal number and their bank account well in advance of their application, because they're two relatively straightforward things to do, but they just require a bit of time.
Okay, thanks. Now, what about the internet? I know in Spain the internet can be variable. It's getting a lot better. Overall, it's very good coverage, but there are areas where you don't get very good coverage at all and have to use satellite and the like. What is it like in Portugal? Is it generally good, and are there areas where it's not so good?
Yeah, so I think generally Portugal is better than Spain in that regard, and only for one reason: it's a much smaller country, and therefore, in Spain you have many inland areas which are quite frankly quite remote from large cities. So in Portugal, I would describe the coverage. So the coverage is generally excellent, and the reliability is very good. But sometimes the speeds are not the greatest because you're in a rural location or something else. And so we get a lot of inquiries from people saying, oh, I work remotely and I want sort of high-speed internet and fiber. And honestly, you're not going to find fiber in the hills. For example, you're just not. You don't need satellites in order to get it, but you're going to get ADSL, but you're going to get, very modest upload and download speeds. You can do everything you need to do. You're just going to be doing it at a slower pace. So I think, generally coverage and black spots, which existed maybe 15, 20 years ago, those black spots have pretty much all been eliminated to the best of my knowledge, certainly for most of the areas in which the people listening to this webinar will be interested in moving to. They will not have an issue in getting an internet a signal. In major areas, there's fiber, sort of 100 megs, and that sort of speed or velocity, or even more. And so it's pretty reliable. Again, the big issue tends to be the monopoly. So we come back to my point about the bureaucracy in dealing with service providers. You'll find that in some areas of the country, this sort of ex-state provider, which is now sort of, I think it's semi-privatized or whatever it is, but it is the only provider of the service, and therefore there's no choice. You can't go with anyone else. You can't kind of say, well, I didn't like what you're doing, I'm going somewhere else. You literally cannot.
Okay, and obviously everybody moving to Portugal will be looking there for the lifestyle and the culture and so on, but many will want to hold on to their favourite UK programmes. When it comes to accessing UK TV, how easy is that to do?
Okay, not as easy as it was 10 years ago, to be fair, but I think the same challenges as in Spain. Most people would have to work with a satellite provider and may need to use a VPN, which is a virtual private network. So it's basically just something that hides where you are. So if you ever travel, for those of you who've traveled, so you go into Portugal or Spain and you look at your mobile and then you try to use, for example, I don't know, BBC, the app on your phone, and you try and watch a program, it'll say to you, oh, this program is not available in your area or region, or whatever the message is that it was. Well, that's because in this case, for example, the BBC is a public and publicly funded. However, how much longer that model is going to remain, that's up for debate in its own right. But it's a publicly funded and therefore intended to be for UK residents, and maybe the armed forces abroad and people like that who have special channels. So it wasn't intended to be, available publicly everywhere. So that means that you literally have to use something like a VPN, which confuses the service and shows up, you show up as being sort of in Glasgow instead of being in Girona, for example, or in this case in Porto. So that's something you will need to do, similar to Spain. But you can also just use, and this is increasingly a popular choice with all sorts of age demographics, and that is to use channels like Netflix, which come with all these what do you call them, these sort of packages of shows, and you can stream the shows and you can use a Fire Stick and whatever. And then the other thing which shouldn't be discounted is that many Portuguese cable packages, so you will typically sign up to an internet and a cable package sort of setup scenario, and there are plenty of channels bundled into that package, and you'll definitely always get English, and I'm talking both American English and UK English channels such as BBC News, BBC World News, Sky News, that. So you'll get all of the English news channels, and you'll get a lot of the series that are shown on other channels, which so I don't know, crime series or whatever, not necessarily all the UK crime series, but there'll be some other crime series, US and whatever, that you can see. So these are the different options available.
Okay, well, one of the other options, the one that we use here in Spain, is a thing called IPTV, which is basically a system where you get a whole series of different programs, and in my case, all of the Sky channels, all of the Sky Sports, Sky Movies, everything, as well as lots of Norwegian and Belgian and Dutch and so on as well. And it comes from a organisation based out of Cyprus, in my case, and they're probably breaking various regional rules by providing it, but to a large extent I think it's taken the view that that's the provider's problem rather than the users. So if you're comfortable with that sort of arrangement, I think that could be an option that's generally available.
Yeah. And that's streamed, right, Nigel? That's streamed. It's an internet,
It's through the internet. Yeah. You get a little box that you attach to the television. And so we've got a question here from Peggy. She's from the US. Can you talk about VAT tax compared to sales tax? Does Portugal tax US Social Security and private pensions? I think the basic answer there is that if you become tax resident, then you will be subject to tax on your worldwide income. There are double tax treaties that work out what, if you're being taxed both in the US and in Portugal, what happens. But that's really a question for a sort of, accountant, a specialist or whatever. And we do have David Franks talking about financial issues on the 7th of April. And so if you wanted to attend that, you're going to get sort of answers to those sort of questions on that. In terms of VAT, that's simply a calculation issue. Sales tax works slightly differently, but effectively VAT is just an add-on tax onto the value of the goods you're purchasing.
I think the key thing to point out here is that the prices. So, I mean, I think these are that question has two radically different components. One was to do with social security, which is clearly nothing to do with VAT and related. The thing to note is that prices in Portugal are inclusive of whatever tax. So you're not adding on the tax afterwards to the price that is shown on the shelf, shall we say, when you're buying goods or at a restaurant buying services, whatever. There is one group of exceptions, and that is if you are a business and you go into a wholesaler, then you will, but this won't apply for most people listening to this webinar. If you are going into a wholesale warehouse or whatever it is and buying things for a restaurant or whatever, then there will be a net of VAT price, because you will then treat VAT in a different way because you are considered buying for your business. So that's an exception and doesn't apply for pretty much anyone that I'm aware of. So VAT is included in the price of goods and services. Actually, I should say this. That's a good point. The VAT is included in the price of goods, but it's never included in the price of service, or hardly ever included in the price of services for Portuguese companies. So what they'll do is they quote your price of a service, and they will slap 23% on that at the end.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So the all-in price for services. I can't remember if I remember a day when it was sort of included and built into the price, but because VAT is so high in Portugal, it's one of the highest within the EU, and it's one of the government's main sources of tax, other than corporation tax and personal income tax, and fuel tax. Fuel tax is massive, massive. 60-something% of the cost of fuel is tax in Portugal, one of the highest in the world, I think. And but companies will just pass on that VAT straight to you as an end consumer.
Okay, well, thank you. There's no other questions. There is one comment from William that he uses FreeSat for his TV access and says it's excellent. So a ringing endorsement for that option. So we'll call it end there. Thank you very much, Lewis.
It's a pleasure.
Just to say that. As I hope made it clear, our role here is to help you make your move to Portugal. So if you have any questions, if you'd like us to refer you to Lewis or to any other members of our extensive and carefully chosen network of service providers, then please contact us, expats@expatnetwork.com. Any questions we'll either answer ourselves or we will find somebody who knows the answer. I'd also just like to mention Discovery Tours. Lewis does Discovery Tours, and we are doing Discovery Tours in Spain and Portugal, and effectively we will pass you on to Lewis in Portugal. So if you want to do, the idea of those is it's a sort of tailored program to explain and to give you familiarity of the area that you're looking to move to. I think even if you've spent holidays there, you have to remember that living can be very different, and there can be very different areas within one particular city or town or area, and those, it's important to know all the things about what's good about those areas and what's bad. Is it in the shade? What's it like out of season? What's the internet coverage in that area, and so on. And those are the issues that are there before you decide on the actual property you're going to buy. So we can set those up if you're interested, and Lewis will obviously want to help you to buy a property ultimately, and if he was happy to do that, and the only terms of that will be agreed in advance. So the tour itself is free, but if you choose to use Lewis, there's no obligation to do so, then the terms of that will be agreed in advance. So, okay, thank you, and thank you very much, Lewis, and we'll call it an end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nigel.
Cheers. Bye.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.